walls that makes us feel safe. They protect us, shield us from the outside world, create boundaries between here and there, between us and them. But sometimes, walls hide things we were never meant to find. In the basement of a state-of-the-art research facility at Yale University, behind a utility panel designed to conceal pipes and wiring, investigators discovered something that would haunt them forever. A body, folded into an impossibly small space, hidden in the darkness where no one was supposed to look. The woman had been there for 5 days. 5 days while hundreds of people walked past that wall, while security cameras recorded every entrance and exit, while the world searched desperately for answers. And on the day they found her, she was supposed to be walking down an aisle in a white dress, promising forever to the man she loved. Instead, Annie Lowe was pulled from a wall, and a community's sense of safety crumbled with her. Let's go back to the beginning. Annie Lowe was born in 1985, and from her very first breath, she embodied the complexity of the American immigrant experience. Her parents had come to the United States from Vietnam, part of that generation that fled their homeland, seeking safety and opportunity in a country they'd never seen. Like so many immigrant families, they carried with them dreams that were bigger than their circumstances, hopes that burned brighter than any hardship they would face. They settled in California, where a growing Vietnamese American community provided cultural connection and support. But Annie's childhood would take an unexpected turn. She spent her childhood in Placerville, California, with her aunt and uncle. This arrangement wasn't unusual in Vietnamese families, where extended family networks often step in to help raise children, where the boundaries between nuclear and extended family are more fluid than in mainstream American culture. In Placerville, a small town in El Dorado County nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, Annie grew up in a household that valued education above almost everything else. Her aunt and uncle instilled in her the belief that academic excellence was not just a goal, but an expectation, not just a path to success, but a moral obligation to honor the sacrifices that had been made for her to be here. And Annie delivered. She didn't just meet expectations, she exceeded them in ways that left teachers and classmates in awe. She was valedictorian of her graduating class at Union Mine High School in El Dorado, California, and voted most likely to be the next Einstein. Think about that for a moment. Not just valedictorian, though that alone would have been impressive, but her classmates looked at Annie Lowe and saw someone who could change the world, someone who could unlock the mysteries of the universe, someone who belonged in the same conversation as the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century. She earned approximately $160,000 in scholarship money, a staggering amount that spoke to just how exceptional she was. Universities competed for her, offering financial packages that would have been unthinkable for most students. Annie had options. She could have gone anywhere, could have chosen any path. She chose the University of Rochester, a prestigious private research university in upstate New York, far from the California sunshine she'd grown up under. At Rochester, Le majored in cell and developmental biology with a minor in medical anthropology. It was an unusual combination, reflecting Annie's broad intellectual curiosity. Cell and developmental biology is hardcore science, the kind of field that requires you to think at the molecular level, to understand the intricate machinery makes life possible. Medical anthropology, on the other hand, is about understanding health and medicine in cultural context, about recognizing that science doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is always practiced by humans in human societies with all the complexity that entails. Annie was someone who could move comfortably between the laboratory and the library, between microscopes and manuscripts, between the empirical and the interpretive. But college wasn't just about hitting the books for Annie. It was where she would meet Jonathan Wadowski, and they attended the University of Rochester together. Their relationship developed over shared late-night study sessions and walks through campus, over coffee dates and conversations about their dreams for the future. Friends who knew them as a couple describe a relationship that just worked, that natural kind of partnership where two people bring out the best in each other. Jonathan wasn't intimidated by Annie's brilliance. He celebrated it, and Annie, for all her academic intensity, knew how to laugh and relax, how to be present in a moment rather than always thinking 3 steps ahead. After graduating from Rochester, Annie set her sights even higher. She was accepted into the doctoral program at the Yale School of Medicine's Department of Pharmacology, one of the most prestigious programs in the country. This wasn't just an achievement, it was validation of everything Annie had worked for, everything her family had hoped for her, everything those scholarship committees had bet on when they'd offered her money. Yale. The name itself carries weight, represents centuries of excellence, opens doors that remain closed to most people. Annie Lee, the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants raised by her aunt and uncle in a small California town, was going to get her PhD from Yale University. She arrived in New Haven, Connecticut in 2007, ready to immerse herself in the kind of cutting-edge research that could change medicine. Yale's pharmacology program is renowned, attracting the brightest minds from around the world to study how drugs interact with biological systems at the most fundamental level. Annie's research focused on understanding these interactions, work that could potentially lead to breakthrough treatments for diseases that had resisted conventional approaches. By September 2009, Annie was deep into her doctoral work. At 24 years old, she was doing the kind of research that most people can't even understand, let alone accomplish. She spent long hours in the laboratory at 10 Amistad Street, a modern research facility that had been completed just 2 years earlier. The building was designed with security in mind, equipped with multiple levels of access control and dozens of security cameras. It had to be secure because of the sensitive nature of the work conducted inside, particularly the animal research that was essential to much of the medical testing done there. Animal research has long been a flashpoint, attracting protests from activists who believe the practice is cruel and unnecessary. At some universities, these protests have turned violent, with researchers receiving death threats and facilities being vandalized. So Yale took security at 10 Amistad Street very seriously. You couldn't just walk in off the street. Entering the building required an electronic ID card coded specifically for people who had a legitimate reason to be there. Getting into the basement required another level of access. Certain parts of the basement were restricted to yet a third subgroup of employees who worked directly with the animals. There were approximately 70 security cameras monitoring entrances, exits, and hallways. It should have been one of the safest places on campus. positions at Yale were worlds apart. While Annie was pursuing a doctorate and conducting research that could advance medical science, Clark worked as an animal research technician. His job was to maintain the laboratory animals used in experiments, to ensure they were properly fed and housed, to monitor their health and maintain detailed records. It was important work, necessary work, but it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of work that would get your name in scientific journals or lead to groundbreaking discoveries. Those who worked with Clark described him as someone who took his job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. He was particular about procedures, about following protocols exactly, about maintaining the animal facilities to his exacting standards. Some interpreted this as professionalism and dedication. Others found it controlling, noted that he could become agitated when he felt others weren't following procedures properly, that he seemed to take even minor infractions personally. But in September 2009, Annie Lowe wasn't thinking about Raymond Clark or workplace tensions. She was thinking about her wedding. After years together, Annie and Jonathan had decided to make it official, to stand before their families and friends and promise to build a life together. They had chosen September 13th, 2009 as their wedding day, with a ceremony planned at the North Ritz Club in Syosset, New York, about 2.5 hours from New Haven. Wedding planning while pursuing a doctorate is no small feat. Annie was juggling the demands of her research, experiments that had to be completed on schedule, data that had to be analyzed and interpreted, with all the 1,000 little details that go into planning a wedding: dress fittings, seating charts, menu selections, music choices, invitations, decorations. Friends would later remember Annie talking about the big day, her face lighting up with that characteristic smile, her enthusiasm infectious even to those who had been through the wedding planning process and knew how stressful it could be. The morning of Tuesday, September 8th, 2009 started like any other day for Annie Lowe. She had work to do, experiments to run, data to collect. 5 days until her wedding. 5 days until she would become Mrs. Wadowski, until she would start that next chapter of her life. She left her apartment that morning, probably going over her to-do list in her head, the research tasks she needed to complete, and the wedding details she still needed to finalize. Around 10 in the morning, Annie arrived at her office at Sterling Hall of Medicine. She took care of some paperwork, checked her email, prepared for the work she needed to do at the laboratory. Then, she walked the few blocks to 10 Amistad Street, the laboratory building where she conducted her research. A security camera captured the moment. Annie Lowe, small and slight at 4 feet 11 inches and barely 90 pounds, walking up to the building entrance. She swiped her ID card. The door clicked open with that familiar sound, and she walked inside. The timestamp on the video read 10 a.m., and then Annie Lowe disappeared. Hours passed. The morning turned to afternoon, the afternoon to evening. Annie didn't return to her office. She didn't answer her phone when Jonathan called to check in. She didn't respond to text messages from friends. She didn't show up for a meeting she had scheduled. None of the 70 security cameras surrounding the building and attached garage showed her leaving. Think about that for a moment. 70 cameras, monitoring every entrance, every exit, every pathway in and out of that building, and not a single one of them captured Annie Lowe leaving. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the building itself. When Annie failed to come home Everyone who knew Annie described her as responsible, organized, someone who was always where she said she would be when she said she would be there. If Annie said she would be home by 6, she was home by 6. If she had a meeting, she showed up on time. She didn't just disappear without telling anyone. Jonathan tried calling repeatedly, straight to voicemail. Her roommate hadn't seen her since that morning. Her friends hadn't heard from her. The last confirmed sighting was that security camera footage showing her entering 10 Amistad Street at 10 in the morning. On Wednesday morning, September 9th, Yale reported Annie Lee missing. The university police issued an alert to campus and local media. A 24-year-old graduate student was missing, and they wanted help in finding her. They released Annie's photo, that beautiful smile that everyone who knew her remembered, and asked anyone with information to come forward. The speculation began almost immediately, as it always does when someone disappears under mysterious circumstances. Could she have gotten cold feet about the wedding? It's not unheard of for brides and grooms to panic as their wedding day approaches, to suddenly feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the commitment they're about to make. But those who knew Annie dismissed this theory almost immediately. She wasn't the type to run away from her problems. She was excited about marrying Jonathan, had been talking about the wedding for months. If she'd had doubts, she would have talked to him, worked through them. She wouldn't just vanish 5 days before the ceremony. Could she have suffered some kind of emotional or mental breakdown? Again, possible in theory, but it didn't fit what anyone knew about Annie. She was handling the stress of her doctoral program and wedding planning with her characteristic competence. She wasn't showing signs of unusual stress or anxiety. She seemed happy, excited about the future. There was a fire alarm in the building on Tuesday afternoon, shortly after Annie had entered. Could she have sneaked past the cameras during the confusion of the evacuation? But even this seemed unlikely. The cameras covered all the exits, and why would Annie want to sneak out? Where would she go? It made no sense. As Wednesday turned to Thursday and Thursday to Friday, the case attracted more and more national attention. There was something about Annie's story that captured the public imagination. Part of it was the mystery. How does someone vanish from inside a secure building with cameras everywhere? Part of it was the timing. The brilliant young student about to marry her college sweetheart. Part of it was Annie herself, that combination of academic excellence and warm personality that made people root for her, want her to be found safe. News trucks began arriving in New Haven, parking outside 10 Amistad Street, outside Annie's apartment, outside the Yale campus. Reporters stood in front of cameras describing the search, interviewing anyone who would talk to them, speculating about what might have happened. It became a top story on the national news networks: CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. All of them devoted significant coverage to the missing Yale student. Yale University offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to Annie's whereabouts. It was a substantial amount, enough to motivate people to come forward if they knew something. Jonathan came in from New York, his wedding just days away, but his fiancée missing. Annie's family flew in from California, her aunt and uncle who had raised her, frantic with worry. They held a press conference, pleading for information, for anyone who might have seen something to come forward. More than 100 law enforcement officers joined behind the search. New Haven Police, Yale Police, Connecticut State Police, even FBI agents were involved. They focused their efforts on 10 Amistad Street, the last place Annie had been seen alive. They pored over the security footage, watching Annie walk into the building again and again, looking for any detail they might have missed. They interviewed everyone who had been in the building that day, checking alibis, looking for anything suspicious. They began searching the building itself, methodically going through laboratories, storage rooms, offices. They brought in dogs trained to detect human remains. The search expanded beyond the building, grimly including a trash incinerator 40 miles away, the horrible possibility that Annie's body might have been disposed of there. And then, on Saturday, September 12th, 4 days after Annie had disappeared, investigators found something that changed everything. Hidden above a ceiling tile in the 10 Amistad Street building, they discovered bloody clothing. The discovery was not made public immediately, but it marked the moment when this case shifted from a missing persons investigation to an almost certain homicide. If there was bloody clothing hidden in the building, then Annie Lowe was probably dead. And if her bloody clothing was in the building, then Annie herself was probably in the building too. The search intensified. If Annie's body was somewhere in 10 Amistad Street, the investigators needed to find her. They became even more methodical, more thorough, checking spaces that seemed too small, too inaccessible, too unlikely. They opened utility panels, looked behind machinery, examined every corner of every room, working their way through the building floor by floor, room by room. Sunday, September 13th, 2009, Annie Lowe's wedding day, the day that should have been the happiest of her life, the day she had been planning for months, the day when she would have stood before her family and friends and promised to love Jonathan forever. At the North Ritz Club in Syosset, New York, there were supposed to be flowers and music, a beautiful ceremony followed by dinner and dancing and celebration. Instead, there was cancellation and grief and unanswered questions. And in New Haven, Connecticut, in the basement of a laboratory building at 10 Amistad Street, investigators made a discovery that would shock the nation. Behind a utility panel in the basement, in a narrow space designed to conceal pipes and wiring, they found Annie Lou's body. She had been forced into an impossibly small space, her body contorted to fit behind the panel, hidden in the darkness where no one should have been looking. The Connecticut Medical Examiner's autopsy found that Lee's death was a result of traumatic asphyxia due to neck compression. She had been strangled. The medical examiner would later testify that there were signs she had fought back, that she hadn't died easily or quickly, that she had struggled against her attacker. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on September 13th, at the exact time when Annie should have been walking down the aisle in her wedding dress, Yale President Richard Levin sent a letter to the campus community. It began with 6 words that would echo through the halls and classrooms and laboratories. It is my tragic duty to report that the body of a female was found in the basement of the Amistad building late this afternoon. Though Levin didn't immediately confirm the identity everyone knew, the bloody clothing found the day before, the location in the building Annie had entered 5 days earlier and never left, the timing, it all pointed to one terrible conclusion. Later that evening, the medical examiner would officially confirm what everyone already understood. The body was Annie La. The question that haunted everyone was simple and impossible. Who would do this? Who would murder Annie La, this brilliant young woman who, by all accounts, had no enemies, who was loved by everyone who knew her? And how had they done it in a building with dozens of security cameras and multiple levels of access control? The investigation moved quickly now. The focus wasn't on finding Annie anymore. It was on finding her killer, and the investigators had a crucial piece of evidence: the building's electronic access records. Every time someone used their ID card to enter the building or access a restricted area, the system recorded it. Time, date, location, user ID. It created a digital trail of everyone's movements throughout the building. Clark's movements the day of Lou's disappearance were precisely tracked by the use of his computer entry cards to rooms in the lab building. Strollo said Clark entered 2 of those rooms, including the room where Lou was killed, many more times than on previous days. The electronic records showed that Annie had used her card to enter a restricted basement lab area, and then, shortly after, Raymond Clark III had swiped into the same area. It was one of the areas where Clark regularly worked, one of the spaces he was responsible for maintaining as an animal research technician. The police began focusing on Clark. They interviewed him multiple times, asking about his interactions with Annie, about where he had been on Tuesday morning, about why his card showed so many more swipes than usual that day. They searched his apartment, looking for evidence. They asked for a DNA sample, which Clark initially refused to provide voluntarily, leading police to obtain a warrant. Investigators focused on Clark early in the investigation and searched his apartment Tuesday. When they labeled him a person of interest, he remained under constant surveillance after he was released early Wednesday and found a room at the Super 8 motel in Cromwell, Connecticut. The police followed him everywhere, watching his every move, waiting for the DNA results that they believed would confirm what the card swipe records suggested. And then the DNA evidence came back. Among the evidence was a bloody sock with both Clark's and Lee's DNA on it, as well as a pen found under Lee's body with Clark's DNA. The DNA evidence was damning. Clark's DNA was found in multiple locations connected to the crime: on bloody clothing, at the scene where Annie had been killed, on items near her body. Police found DNA of both the Clark and Lou in the ceiling and in the wall recess, the spaces where the killer had hidden evidence and concealed the body. On September 17th, police arrested Raymond Clark, a 24-year-old laboratory technician who had been working in the same building. 5 days after Annie's body had been found, 9 days after she had disappeared, the police finally had their suspect in custody. The arrest shocked the Yale community. This wasn't a stranger who had somehow breached security and entered the building. This wasn't some random act of violence by an outsider. This was Raymond Clark III, a colleague, someone who worked in the same building, who had passed Annie in hallways and shared workspaces with her, someone who had every right to be in that building, who had access to all those restricted areas, who knew the layout and the blind spots. One colleague murdered and another accused. It's the talk of the medical school, said Laura Smith, president of Local 34, the union that represents clerical and technical workers, including Clark. Nobody could talk about anything else. How do you process this? How do you go to work in a so horrible. During the brief proceeding, he kept his head bowed and spoke very little, entering a not guilty plea to charges of murder and felony murder. Clark was ordered held on a $3 million bond. Police Chief James Lewis said, characterizing the case as workplace violence, not a random attack, not a domestic dispute, not a robbery gone wrong. Workplace violence. Two people who knew each other through their jobs, who interacted in the course of their daily work, and somehow that professional relationship had ended in murder. But why? What was the motive? This became the question that everyone wanted answered, but that seemed to have no satisfying explanation. There was no evidence of a romantic relationship between Annie and Raymond Clark. There was no apparent financial motive. Clark hadn't benefited in any way from Annie's death. So why had he killed her? The theory that emerged, though never fully confirmed in all its details, suggested that the murder grew out of tensions over laboratory procedures. Clark was known to be particular, some would say obsessive, about maintaining the animal research facilities. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, about following protocols exactly, about cleanliness and organization. Some reports suggested that Annie had complained about Clark, or that there had been disagreements between them about how the animal facilities were being maintained. Could something so mundane, such ordinary workplace friction, really escalate to murder? It seemed impossible. People disagree about work procedures all the time. They have conflicts about how things should be done, about who's responsible for what. They get annoyed with each other, frustrated, even angry. But they don't kill each other. Except sometimes they do. Clark's history offered some troubling hints about his capacity for violence. His high school girlfriend came forward after the arrest with a disturbing story. She told Good Morning America that she had to call the police when she broke up with him. I wanted out of the relationship because he would get very angry often. He would frighten me. He would get physical. After the breakup, for about 2 weeks, I was escorted from the school to my car. She also told police that Clark had forced her to have sex with him, though she had declined to press charges at the time. Other women who had known Clark described similar experiences, a pattern of controlling behavior, difficulty accepting when relationships ended, anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered it. But Clark had never been arrested, had never been convicted of any crime. On paper, when Yale hired him, he looked like a normal employee, nothing to worry about, no red flags. And yet the evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA evidence, the card swipe records showing his movements that day, the physical evidence found at the crime scene and in the wall where Annie's body had been concealed. The case against Raymond Clark III seemed airtight, but building a case and proving it in court are two different things. Murder trials can drag on for years, can be expensive and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Annie's family would have to sit through testimony about how their daughter died, would have to see photos from the crime scene, would have to relive that terrible week over and over again. Jonathan would have to testify, would have to describe the life he and Annie had been planning, the wedding that never happened. And so, on March 17th, 2011, more than a year and a half after Annie's death, Raymond Clark III made a decision. In a Connecticut courtroom, with his entire family looking on, Raymond Clark III pled guilty to the murder and sexual assault of Yale University graduate student Annie Lee. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial and the possibility of a longer sentence. Ray Clark eventually pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for a 44-year prison sentence. He previously faced charges of murder and felony murder, both of which held a prison sentence of 60 years in prison. So by pleading guilty and sparing the state the expense of a trial, Clark reduced his potential sentence by 16 years. At his sentencing, Clark spoke briefly. He said that Annie was and would always be a wonderful person, by far a better person that I will ever be in my life. It was a strange moment, this acknowledgement from the man who had killed her, who had strangled her in a basement laboratory and then hidden her body in a wall, who had let her family and fiancé suffer through 5 days of not knowing what had happened to her, who had stolen everything from a young woman who had done nothing to deserve it. Some interpreted his words as genuine remorse. Others saw them as a hollow performance, words carefully chosen by his lawyers to show contrition, but meaning nothing. For Annie's family, the plea provided some measure of closure, but it couldn't bring her back. It couldn't fill the hole left in their lives. It couldn't answer all their questions about why this had happened. Her family's attorney said it was a tough day because of this public acknowledgement that somebody murdered and attempted to sexually assault this poor, young, sweet girl for no reason. No reason. That's what made it so hard to accept. If there had been some logical motive, some understandable explanation, maybe it would have been easier to process. But there was no reason that made sense. No explanation that could justify what had been done to Annie. The wedding that should have taken place on September 13th, 2009 never happened, of course. Jonathan Wadowski lost his fiancée, his future wife, the woman he had planned to spend his life with. The wedding venue was canceled. The flowers that had been ordered were never delivered. The dress Annie had chosen hung unused in a closet. Friends who should have been celebrating with a happy couple attended a funeral instead. The Vietnamese community in San Jose, California, where Annie's parents still lived, mourned the loss of one of their brightest stars. Here was a young woman who had embodied everything immigrant parents dream of for their children: academic excellence, a prestigious university degree, a promising future. Parents had pointed to Annie as an example of what their children could achieve if they worked hard enough, studied hard enough, dedicated themselves completely. And now they had to explain to those same children why hard work and talent and doing everything right couldn't always keep you safe. Why sometimes terrible things happen to wonderful people for no good reason. The Yale community struggled with the implications of what had happened. This was supposed to be one of the safest, most secure places in the world, an Ivy League institution with resources and protocols and multiple layers of protection. The building where Annie died had been designed with security in mind, had electronic access controls and dozens of cameras, and yet all of that security hadn't prevented a colleague from murdering a student in a basement laboratory. Yale President Richard Levin acknowledged that it touched off sensitivities of a community and brought to the surface anxieties about security in various parts of the campus, in particular the medical school. Students looked at their classmates and coworkers differently now, aware in a way they hadn't been before that you can never really know is capable of. The medical school, where Annie had been pursuing her doctorate, was particularly shaken. Graduate students who had felt safe in their laboratories now felt vulnerable. I'm in my 30th year now at Yale, and I can count on one hand incidents that even rise to the level of workplace violence, Union President Smith said. But there are holes to be plugged, and something like this brings those to the fore. The university began reviewing its security protocols, looking for ways to prevent something like this from happening again. They strengthened background checks for new employees, enhanced security camera coverage in certain areas, revised protocols for access to restricted areas. But everyone acknowledged that perfect security is impossible, that someone determined to do harm will often find a way, that the real threat had come from inside, from someone who already had all the access he needed. Nearly 2 years to the day that she was murdered, the family of Yale graduate student Annie Lee filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the university. The suit, filed Tuesday in Connecticut Superior Court in New Haven, claims Yale failed to adequately protect women for years, accusing the college of insufficiently addressing incidents of sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. The lawsuit argued that Yale had ignored warning signs about Clark, that a culture of inadequate response to harassment and assault had created an environment where someone like Clark could remain employed even as his controlling and aggressive behavior became apparent to others. The lawsuit was controversial. Some supported the family's right to hold Yale accountable, to demand that the university examine how it had failed to protect Annie. Others felt that Yale couldn't have reasonably predicted or prevented what Clark did, that holding the university responsible was unfair. The case was eventually settled confidentially, with the terms never made public, but the lawsuit had already served a purpose. It had forced a public conversation about campus security, about how universities respond to reports of harassment and concerning behavior, about the responsibility institutions have to protect their students and employees. Raymond Clark III is currently serving his 44-year sentence in a Connecticut prison. He'll be eligible for parole eventually, though given the nature of his crime, it's unclear whether he'll ever be released. He gives no interviews, makes no public statements. The man who killed Annie Lee has faded into obscurity, his name mentioned only when people tell Annie's story, a footnote in someone else's tragedy. Annie Lee never got to walk down that aisle. She never got to say her vows, or dance at her reception, or start the life she had planned with Jonathan. She never got to complete her doctorate, never got to become Dr. Annie Lee, never got to make the discoveries she was working toward. She never got to have children, or grow old, or experience all the things that should have been ahead of her. Her life was stolen from her at 24, in a basement laboratory where she should have been safe, by someone she had every reason to trust. The pharmacology department at Yale has continued its work, of course. Other graduate students have come and gone, conducting their research, writing their dissertations, earning their degrees. The laboratory at 10 Amistad Street remains operational, researchers still conducting experiments there, the work going on. Life continues, as it always does, even in the places where terrible things have happened. But for those who were there in September 2009, who walked those hallways during the search, who felt the shift from hope to dread to horrible confirmation, that building will never be quite the same. was found has been sealed and refinished, but the memory remains. Every time someone walks past that spot, they remember. Every time a graduate student enters that building alone, they think about Annie Le. Every time there's a workplace disagreement or tension between colleagues, someone wonders if it could escalate into something worse. The case has been featured on numerous true crime shows and podcasts, examined from every angle by people trying to understand how and why it happened. Criminologists have analyzed Clark's psychology, trying to identify warning signs that might help prevent future tragedies. Security experts have studied the building's systems, looking for lessons about access control and surveillance. Domestic violence advocates have pointed to Clark's history with his high school girlfriend as an example of why reports of controlling behavior and sexual assault should be taken seriously, even when charges aren't filed. Annie Lou's story has become a cautionary tale, but what lesson are we supposed to learn from it? That security measures aren't enough, that we should be more careful about who we hire, that warning signs should be taken more seriously. All of these things are true, and yet none of them would have definitively prevented what happened to Annie. Raymond Clark had no criminal record. He had worked at Yale for years without any major incidents. The security systems in the building were state-of-the-art, and still, Annie Lou died. Maybe the lesson is simpler and more uncomfortable, that sometimes there is no lesson, no clear path to prevention, no obvious warning signs that everyone missed. Sometimes someone who seems normal, who has a regular job and no criminal history, turns out to be capable of terrible violence. Sometimes the people we work with every day, who we pass in hallways and say hello to, are hiding darkness that we can't see until it's too late. Or maybe the lesson is about the preciousness and fragility of life, about how quickly everything can change, about how we should treasure the people we love while we have them. Annie Le was supposed to have decades ahead of her. She was supposed to make groundbreaking discoveries, raise a family, grow old with Jonathan. Instead, she got 5 days hidden in a wall, and a story that ends far too soon. Years later, people still remember Annie Le, not just as a victim, but as the brilliant, warm, accomplished young woman she was. Her friends remember her smile, her kindness, her incredible work ethic. Her professors remember a student who asked insightful questions and pushed the boundaries of her research. Her family remembers a daughter who made them proud every single day. 5 days. That's how long Annie was hidden in that wall, while her family hoped and prayed, while investigators searched, while the world watched and waited. 5 days that led to a discovery on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The cruelty of that timing, the awful coincidence of being found on her wedding day, seems almost too perfect, too horrible to be real. But it was real. It happened. And somewhere in California, a family carries on without their daughter. Somewhere, a man carries on without his fiancée. And in New Haven, Connecticut, in a basement at 10 Amistad Street, there is a wall that still whispers its secret to anyone who will listen, that safety is an illusion, that evil can wear a familiar face, that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very places we need protection from. Annie Le deserved better. She deserved her wedding day, her doctorate, her life. She deserved to grow old with Jonathan, to make her parents proud, to contribute to science and make the world a better place. Instead, she got a wall in a basement and a story that ends too soon. in a place where it never should have ended at all. That's the thing about walls. We build them to keep the bad things out, but sometimes the bad things are already inside, and sometimes the walls that were supposed to protect us become our tombs. Annie Le was found in a wall on September 13th, 2009, on what was supposed to be her wedding day. And every year on that date, people remember not just how she died, but how she lived. Brilliantly, kindly, with purpose and promise. That's the Annie Le who deserves to be remembered, not the victim in the wall, but the valedictorian voted most likely to be the next Einstein, the doctoral student conducting groundbreaking research, the young woman about to marry her college sweetheart. That's who Annie Le was, and that's who we should never forget. Thank you for listening to the case of Annie Le. We'll be back next Thursday